creating, instantiating to rendering the response to us, it will undergo several phases. So these are all the various phases actually. And in the life cycle hooks, which are controlled by using some important events. And these are the options we learned. That means the first phase in a component cycle is ng on changes. And what happens in this ng on changes? We discuss. Okay, then after on changes, ng init. The basic is on changes is responsible for binding with the properties and all. And on init comes after changes. It initializes the values, handles the values which are need to be transported across the requests. That is done by ng on init. Do check if any data is not implicitly transported. So then it needs an explicit transporting. Then that is managed by using do check. And after do check, so I already and this is responsible for handling the interactions like input and output activities. Next option is after do check, we have ng after ng after content init. After content init. After do check, so we have this ng content after init, right? What is the intention of this? That means technically what is the intention of this? So let's see. Actually, what happens in this phase? After initialization of memory, after identifying the changes, after technically identifying the changes and manually updating the changes. So this ng after content init, ng after initialization, it is called after ng on init, on initialization. It is called after ng on initialization. And what happens here is this is responsible for rendering the content into the component's view. That means after initialization of memory, the content, that means it is responsible for rendering content into. That means you can simply say that it is sending the content into. So it is responsible for sending the content into the components into the components view, View is the .html file. So whatever data it borrows from other components or whatever data is present, this data is sent into the view. View is the UI. This data is sent into the view at this particular location. It can also send the data into any another component. So it can also render the data into another directive view. That means, so ng after content init is responsible for rendering, means sending the content into the view, the HTML page. And not only that, it can send data into another directives. That means it binds the content into dynamic Angular containers, like into the dynamic Angular containers. We have dynamic Angular containers, like we have ng template and ng container into the contents like ng template and ng container. So technically, whatever data comes and whatever the data is there in the memory, it should be sent to the view UI. That is managed by using ng after content init. Or you can simply say that in this phase, the data is sent to view. The content is sent into the view. So the data is now sent to the view. After data is sent into the view and binded with the view components, then comes ng after content checked. Then comes ng after content checked. This is called after ng after content init. After this, it is called, and it is also called after every ng do check also. That means after every update, modification into the view. That means it is responsible for, this is very important point. It is responsible for content projection. This is a very important term for experienced people. So at expert level interviews, so for high level experienced people, you can find this concept asked, what do you know about content projection in Angular? What is content projection? What is change detection? These are technical terms. What is content projection? Actually, content projection is a way to import HTML content from outside the component and insert that content into the component's template at specific location. This is called content projection. So that means what happens is, after binding data to the view in the current component, it brings the content from external component or child component and renders information into the current component. So you will not find this type of question regularly in fresher interviews. This is very in-depth question. Content projection like terms are used by very high level experienced people. Right? For a fresher, they will simply ask how you will send data from here to there, right? How you will send information from one component to another. Who will manage transporting data from one component to another? And at expert level, they can ask this question: what do you know by content projection? What is the concept of content projection? Actually, content projection is nothing but it is a way to import HTML content from outside the component and insert that content into the components into the components template at specific location. That is what actually the concept of content projection. This is definition. So content projection definition. So actually what happens is, after binding data to view on current component, it brings the content from external component or a child component. You can say child component, and renders into current component. That is another important point. So this happens ng content checked, ng after content checked. That means here two questions. So what is the role of ng after content checked, and what is the role of ng content initialized? What content initialized will do? Content initialized will get the data from your TypeScript file and binds the data to the HTML. That happens. It binds the data and handles, right? Yeah, content projection I already given there, na? We are binding data. We are binding data to the view. In any way you can bind data. So of course it can be from ng model, or by using interpolation data binding technique. We learned property binding, event binding also, na? Kumar, right? So property binding, attribute binding, class binding, everything is getting the information, right? Everything is getting the information from your memory, and it is binding to the view. That happens in ng after content init. Understood? After ng after content init. After the data of current component is binded to HTML, the data coming from external components is binded to your HTML at specific location by using ng after content checked. Are you clear? That means the data of current component is binded to your HTML on which event? Ng after content event, content init event. And after that, the data coming from external components. So this is what generally we call as content projection. Understood? So content projection is nothing but it is importing the content from outside the component. Remember this word, outside the component. Understood? Outside the component. So if it is inside the component, then that is managed by ng after content init. From another component, some data have to come and it need to be binded to the UI. That is managed by using ng after content checked. Content projection is not binding your data, binding the current component data. It is binding the data coming from any external source. Understood? That can be through property binding or That can be through interpolation like techniques that you have learned, right? NG model is currently binding within the component, right? So it is not coming from outside the component. So that doesn't comes under content projection. I hope you are clear. Content projection means if anything coming from outside the source. Okay, right. So that is what actually happens in this particular phase. So that is NG after content checked. After content checked, the next event fires up. NG after view init. NG after view init. This is called after NG after content checked. After this, it is called init is called. Actually, this respond after the Angular initializes the component views and its child views. That means it responds to the view changes. It is a view hierarchy during the changes. Actually, a view hierarchy during the changes. It identifies the changes in the parent or in the child views. So that means after view init, what happens in this phase? What happens in this phase is actually this will respond. That means it initializes, it identifies, it initializes the component views and its child views. That means this fires up after the initialization. It fires up after the initialization of memory for component views and its child views. It will fire up after the initialization of memory for component views and its child views. Actually, it responds to view changes. It responds to the view changes. That means it identifies the changes in the parent or child views. It identifies the changes in parent or child views and updates the content It identifies the changes in parent or child views, such as input of data from parent to child, such as output of data from child to parent, and that means input of data from parent to child, output of data from child to parent. So these are monitored. Actually, this is all under one point only. So actually, from child to parent, these are monitored in NG after view init. That means identifies the changes. It identifies the changes in the parent and child views and update the contents. It will monitor the input of data from parent to child. It will monitor the output of data from child to parent, and it will update changes. It will update those changes. So this is managed by using ng view init. So ng after view init. That means data is binded from the parent and child components. That is content projection. After data comes into the current component, whatever the changes happening in the view, so any modification in the data that parent inputs into child, any modification in the data that child outputs to the parent, these modifications, these changes are tracked. That means tracking of changes between changes in data transportation, tracking of changes in data, and transporting the changes to update. This is managed by this particular view, this particular event. Tracking of changes in data and transporting the changes to update. Remember, don't link with others. This is only between parent and child. This is between parent and child. Tracking of changes between parent and child, identifying the changes happening in the data, transporting those changes, updating those changes. All this is managed by using ng view init, that is after view init, right? So after the changes are identified, those changes need to be sent to the views again finally. That is done by using ng after view checked. So it is called after ng after view init. It is called after ng view init. So it is responsible for rendering. It renders the final content. It renders the final content to parent and child views. It renders the final content to the parent and child views. That means whatever the communication happened between parent and child, this entire communication is managed. And finally, the data which is complete, that means final data. Of course, remember, there will be nothing like final data. Up to that particular point, that is final data until any change occurred. If any change occurred between in the data, then after view init will fire up. It will identify the changes happening between parent and child, and again gets the final content and renders in this particular event, So that is what happens in it, right? That's what happens here. So technically, after finally rendering the data and the user finished using, then then comes the last option, ng on destroy. So what happens in destroy? That means it will clean up the memory before destroying the component. Clean up the memory. So before destroying the component. And important, it will unsubscribe to methods. It will unsubscribe to the methods. Whatever the methods are subscribed, that means unsubscribing the method is nothing but, so the methods which are pointed to handle a specific functionality, the method pointers are dispatched. That means the pointers are destroyed. That means no more mapping of methods will be there. So methods will not be handled. And detach the event handlers. very important is it will destroy the memory allocated for. So that means it is nothing but destroying memory allocated for component. And why we need to destroy the memory allocated for the component? So it is important to handle memory leaks. It is important to handle memory leaks. So to handle memory leaks, it is important to destroy the memory allocated for that particular component. That's what actually the concept here is, right? So this is the regular phases. These are all the phases. That means when a client requests, something technically, suppose a component cycle generally. Suppose here, I'm just giving a rough architecture here. So client requests any component. Makes a request to any component. So that means request component. So requests component. Yeah, when a client requests any component, so client is requesting the component. When client requests the component, now the Angular application loads that into memory. So let it keep it short. Okay, so the request component. So request the component. When a component is requested, now Angular creates the component. Angular creates instance of component. Angular creates instance of component. Actually, it will create an instance of the component. The first stage, so on request, it will create the instance of component. That's what actually happens. After creating the instance of component, so then the next step happens. Then the next step happens is ng on changes. This will fire up. After that, this will fire up. And what happens on ng on changes, I already showed you. And after ng on changes, yeah. The next step is after the changes. The next step is ng on init. That means initialization. Ng on init. This will fire up. So after the changes, this will fire up. So that is after changes, that is the initialization. Okay, that means it is going to initialize. And if anything not happened manually, then comes another option which will fire up manually to update the changes happening. So ng do check. It will perform the custom events. It will fire up those custom events. It identifies the manually changes happened between the components in the component hierarchy. Do check. After that, the data need to be sent. And it need to be handled. So that is managed by using ng after content init. After content init. So it is handled by using ng content after init initialization. After content init, so then the events which need to be handled, so they are, that means the data coming from other components need to be rendered into our current view. That is actually managed by using ng after content checked ng after content checked. That happens here. I will zoom that after this and show you, right? So this is after the content checked happened. And after that, the data need to be initialized. Data need to be initialized and sent here. That means the next step, what happens is, so let's keep this a little farther here. Okay. Why? I'll show that. Yeah. Next step is, after that, then comes the option as ng after view init. After view init. That means the data will be updated there. Okay. The final data need to be updated. And the final data, how it is updated. So the final data, how it is updated. So by using ng view checked, the final data is updated. Keep this aside. Okay. Now one more option here happens is ng. So ng after view checked. ng after view checked will fire up. Okay. And this is the last event that fires up. So before destroying, that is the last event that fires up. Okay, that is the last event that fires up. Now, what happens here? Just the cycle, yeah. Okay, that's the last event that fire up. Fine. Okay. Now the content is destroyed. Let's keep this in a simple way like this. Okay. Okay, just I am rearranging the content correctly. Fine. Now, after this, so finally, whatever is done, it is destroyed. So I will keep this side. I will keep this, because finally what is destroyed, I will show you. Means how we can configure that file. Okay, so here what should happen is the content need to be destroyed. That I will move this a little bit. Yeah, that is what do check happened. And finally here, the Angular component is created by the contents. Okay. And finally, this is done by your Angular application and it is destroyed. So it initialized and it is destroyed. So what is the last event that fires up is, so it is ng on destroy, destroy. That is the last event that fires up. After this is of last event that fires up. Now what happens here is, this I will keep in a proper order for your understanding sake, that will be easy. First event is this ng on changes. After that, ng on init. Okay. After that, ng do check. Okay. And after that, so yeah, after that, so we have this ng after view init. Okay, let's continue this here. Fine. And after this, now the initialization and changes will happen. This is our old diagram we are creating, right? So this is done. And finally, the destroy happens. The destroy happens. So the destroy happens finally. And after the destroy is done, after the destroy is done, the component is cleaned up from the memory. After the destroy is done, the component is cleaned up from the memory. That means now last point, what happens is, so Angular removes, or you can the final data will be displayed and rendered to the view. That is the option here. That means this happens in the ng after view checked, the response will be sent. After sending the response, it will clean up. After sending the response, it will clean up and it will destroy. So this is what actually happens in the face. That is what actually happens in the face. So these are the various phases. Actually, this cleanup and destroy happens in a second level, which I will move a little bit below, so that you can clearly understand. Actually, what happens is this part. So up to this part, this part, response is fine, is okay. This destroy will happen after cleanup is finished. After cleanup is finished, that destroy will happen. After cleanup is finished, that destroy will happen. That's what actually happens. That means after cleanup is finished, the destroy will happen. So this is what all the cleanup content here, right? So after the cleanup happened, that means it is sending the response. After sending the response, that means it is sending the response. After sending the response, the memory is allocated and destroyed. Then comes this destroy option. That means then this destroy will fire up. Then this will destroy. This destroy will fire up. This is the last option to be performed. This is the last option to be performed. That means after this data is updated, actually, after the component related data is updated to the client, after the component related data is updated to the client, after this data is updated to client, then what happens is after the data updated to the client, it will destroy. So this is the last action performed. That means the response will be sent by using, the response will be sent to the component by using this ng after view checked. After ng view checked, then it will send the response. That means final data is sent to the client. After sending the final data to the client, then it will perform cleanup. That is done by using destroy. So that means after sending the response, then it will simultaneously destroy the component also. So that is how the life cycle works for a component. This is the component related life cycle. How this life cycle works means just a cycle diagram I'm just displaying. So that is how the component life cycle works. Yeah, the component life cycle, how it works. So this is the component cycle, how it is going to handle the component cycle. Right. So this is the basic life cycle. This is the basic life cycle, how it actually works. So what happens in every phase is very important for you to understand. That means on changes, what are the roles? On init role, do check role, and after content init role. And what happens on ng after content checked. Those are all the points I detailedly discussed here. You need to remember these all points. Now, if you know these points, then a few important concepts here is generally whatever you are understanding here, the concept here is, for example, the two major questions is related. So many will be there, all are important. One is, what is change detection? What is change detection? Technically, what is change detection? That is important. We need to understand, right? And now tell me, what is your definition? What is change detection? Tell me, what do you say? What is change detection? What do you say? Change detection means what? What is change detection? What is your definition of change detection? Change detection. Change detection. Change detection. That is bootstrapping. Static to dynamic is bootstrapping. So detection of, yeah, good. That means you can change, you can say that identifying the changes in the properties that you are binding with the components. Understood? Identifying the changes in the properties that are binded with the components. Am I right? Identifying the changes binded with the component. So that is what actually change detection is. So that is what change detection is, right? So technically identifying the changes, right? So that means ng on changes. So here actually ng on changes, ng on changes, it gets notified with the changes. It gets notified with the changes. Yeah, that's what. Why? Because where your data is stored, where your data is stored in this entire content, where your data is stored, actually initial data where it is present. If you want some data to get from your TypeScript and send it to the view, where should be the data? So which phase is responsible for binding the data? Which phase is for binding the data? Which phase is for binding the data? That means whatever data, right? So ng init, right? On init, ng on init. So first step is first establish a connection between your component TS and HTML for handling data required for your component. Am I right? That is the first step. That is the first step. So that is the reason you will see that whenever you create a component, by default, ng on init will be there. Why by default ng on init will be there? Because the first phase is about getting the data and binding the data, right? Getting the data and binding the data. After getting the data and binding the data, identify, see, while getting the data, binding the data, it has to identify the changes happening in the data. So ng on changes binds the values, but the memory required for those values is defined by ng init. Am I right? ng on changes will bind the values, but the memory required for holding the value. So that means where the values are present. For that, we need a memory to initialize. Am I right? That is done by using this. Yeah, right. Now that is what actually change detection 2 points. Another important point is, another question is, what is change projection? Projection. That is another point. What is change projection? Change detection and change projection. What is change projection? What is change projection? ng init on init not only called once, it can call several times. Whenever the memory required, it will be called. It is not a constructor. Understood? Constructor is called only once. The life cycle methods will be called several times. Constructor will be called once, but this will be called several times. Understood? Yes. And what is change projection? In general terms, what happened? What do you say? Change projection means. Change projection is nothing but means you can say change projection. Actually, they are confusing you in the question actually. Change projection means don't think that content projection. Understood? They are confusing you in the question actually. Change projection means what is content projection? Similarly, change projection. Change projection means, so whatever changes happened, they need to be updated to the HTML. That is what actually change projection. That usually happens in ng after content init. Understood? Content init. So, but this is not any official word. Change projection is not an official word. Right. So, yeah, just like two-way binding. Like you are using ng model. That means it is binding the data to the view, identifying the changes in the view, updating back to the model. Am I right? Yeah. The actual official question is, what is content projection? Content projection. What do you say content projection? Content projection means what? What do you say content projection? Content projection. So I given you here content projection. Yeah. So content projection is nothing but anything that you get outside from other components, get the data and bind to the current component. Am I right? From other components, get the data and bind to the current component. Content. That's what actually. Right. So, yeah. Then another option is in which phase, in which life cycle hook data is transported from one component to another, All these answers are there. That's the reason I'm not giving answers. What do you say? So on which the data is transported from one component to another. Usually the data is transported one component to another in ng do check. That's good, right? Ng do check is responsible for that. Right. Another important is so why to destroy component? Why to destroy component? So you need to destroy component to avoid memory leaks, right? To overcome the issue of memory leaks. You can save the memory. Yes, you can save the memory and the memory leaks. You can prevent the memory leaks. That's important. For that, we need that you need to know about that. All other phases are easy to understand and others you can manage, right? So yeah, cleaning up memory is required because it will reduce the burden on your application. Reducing burden on your application, right? So these are all the important events. You cannot try all these events. Change detection already I given there. In the above, I given an option here. This comes under change detection, right? So what is the change detection? So you can see this is change detection. That is also there, right? That means it can detect and act upon the changes that Angular won't detect implicitly, right? The definition is already there. The points are already there. You need to just, that's the reason some points I already highlighted. No need to write them again and again here. You need to search for these answers in those questions in that particular block. Then at least at the time you search for that, you will read and you will understand about this. Okay. Yeah. So these are all about how we can manage the life cycle components. Now, practically, you cannot implement all of them in one set of examples. It depends on situation and all. We will see one example, how we can manage. So how we can manage. So we will see one example how we can manage one or two events, how actually it updates the changes, binds the changes. One sample example to see this simple life cycle hook point. Not all. So because for everything you cannot put in one example, that's not clear to understand also, depending on the requirement and situation. We will see how we can write these events. Explicitly how we can write this. Remember, these all methods implicitly work. We need to know how these are explicitly written and how to work with them. So we will try one example for that we will see tomorrow, right? Because today is enough. We learned a very important concept, and example will take entire session to understand. We will see one example on this life cycle hooks in tomorrow's session. Then you will be little bit clear about understanding different phases. Okay. So tomorrow we will see one practical example on this concept. Hope you understood all the concept today, right? This I will upload into our classroom and tomorrow we will continue. Okay. Right.